Funes the Memorious is a short story by the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges. It is written from the perspective of an unnamed narrator who relates to us his few experiences with a Uruguayan wonder boy by the name of Ireneo Funes. What made Ireneo wondrous was his apparently instantaneous ability to register everything he experienced in precise detail, and then to store those experiences so vividly in his memory that they each existed as special and unique, distinct from every other experience. Where you and I might remember wedding days or embarrassing moments or particular adventures we happened to also take pictures of, Ireneo's senses were a kind of perfect digital camera that captured everything in its frame impeccably and without interruption, while his brain was an image-keeping warehouse with exhaustive capacity. We, at one glance, can perceive 3 glasses on a table. Funes, all the leaves and tendrils and fruit that make up a grapevine. He knew by heart the form of the southern clouds at dawn on the 30th of April, 1882, and could compare them in his memory with the mottled streaks on a book in Spanish binding he had only seen once. In an essay entitled Borges' Refutation of Nominalism, American philosopher John Stewart notes that the story's premise may come from a thought experiment of Enlightenment thinker John Locke. In the story, the narrator compares Ireneo to Locke, saying that Locke, in the 17th century, postulated and rejected an impossible language in which each individual thing, each stone, each bird, and each branch would have its own name. Stewart sees this as a critical reference for understanding the story, explaining, the passage to which Borges refers comes from Locke's famous An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. There, Locke briefly discusses the idea of a nominalist language of particulars. For the nominalist, abstract concepts do not adequately represent things in the empirical world. Thus, it would be desirable to purge language as far as possible of general concepts, such that it could more accurately reflect what is actually given in our perception. This would involve having individual words for every individual thing, or even every individual perception. Locke goes on to argue against nominalism, and Stewart says Borges does the same by satirizing its worldview, making the character of Ireneo a perfect nominalist specimen, capable of not only perceiving untold detail in the world, but also of remembering all those details, and even seeking to give individual experiences or individual memories individual names, all while ignoring general concepts. Ireneo is nominalism taken to its logical extreme. He agrees that language is inadequate at keeping up with the empirical world and is constantly trying to make the world make sense, even as he sees much more than we can. The narrator says, Ireneo once projected an analogous language to Locke's, but discarded it because it seemed too general to him, too ambiguous. In fact, so dedicated is Ireneo to having specific words for each of his specific experiences that he thought that by the hour of his death, he would not even have finished classifying all the memories of his childhood. Throughout the story, the narrator reminds us of the ironic limits of Ireneo's apparently limitless capacity for memory and sense. Not only was it difficult for Ireneo to comprehend that the generic symbol dog embraces so many unlike individuals of diverse size and form, it bothered him that the dog at 314, seen from the side, should have the same name as the dog at 315, seen from the front. To enter something akin to Ireneo's world, you would have to imagine having a name for a close friend, but also a different name for that friend yesterday, and another name for them the day prior, and another name for them 5 years ago, ad infinitum. To call them Richard today and then point to a picture of them from last week and say, that's you, Richard, would be to betray so much that had changed between now and then. Ireneo perceived these subtle differences to such an extreme that he was surprised by his own face every time he saw it in the mirror. Though Borges uses the perceptive Funes as a reductio ad absurdum argument against the notion of nominalism, we can still learn something useful from his example. The apparent impossibility of the task of adequately naming a thing in the world actually gets us closer in our analytic prowess to what the dialectic demands. In the ABCs of materialist dialectics, Leon Trotsky explores the dialectic through a criticism of the simple, seemingly obvious statement, A is equal to A. He writes, This postulate is accepted as an axiom for a multitude of practical human actions and elementary generalizations, but in reality, A is not equal to A. The narrator of Funes the Memorious is one such practical human, willing to engage in elementary generalizations. He would say that A is equal to A, or similarly, that a dog is a dog, because dog is a general concept that is meant to contain all the very types of dogs, regardless of where or when they exist. But Aurelio, of course, with his sensory precision, would notice that no two dogs are really the same, at least not in any sense that would seem meaningful to him. That's because for Aurelio, one dog isn't even the same as itself, since it has to exist in time and space and is constantly shifting, however minorly, through each. As the narrator explains, Funes could continuously discern the tranquil advances of corruption, of decay, of fatigue. He could note the progress of death, of dampness. He was the solitary and lucid spectator of a multiform, instantaneous, and almost intolerably precise world. Trotsky discusses these same continuous processes by dialectically uncovering what we mean when we say something is equal to itself for a moment of time. How should we really conceive the word moment? If it is an infinitesimal interval of time, then an object is subjected during the course of that moment to inevitable changes. Or is the moment a purely mathematical abstraction, that is, a zero of time? But everything exists in time, and existence itself is an uninterrupted process of transformation. Time is consequently a fundamental element of existence. Thus, the axiom A is equal to A signifies that a thing is equal to itself if it does not change, that is, if it does not exist. Trotsky here is approaching the subject of A is equal to A, similar to the way Funes sees a dog. If the dog exists, it is automatically subjected to a process of space and time. So the dog at 3:14 must be different, if only subtly, from the dog at 3:15. Likewise, A is not equal to A because even the same A must exist in space and time and constantly be altered by both. But unlike the narrator of the story, who places an emphasis on how close such a method is to paralysis, Trotsky is more interested in showing how liberated it is from inadequate categories. In other words, Trotsky is interested in the question, when does a dog is a dog cease being a harmless tautology and begin being a lazy error? Rather than coming from a place of superhuman perception, Trotsky simply breaks down the logic of A equals A, dog equals dog, through a new kind of logic. Trotsky says, in reality, A is not equal to A. This is easy to prove if we observe these two letters under a lens. They are quite different from each other. But, one can object, the question is not of the size or the form of letters, since they are only symbols for equal quantities, for instance, a pound of sugar. The objection is beside the point. In reality, a pound of sugar is never equal to a pound of sugar. A more delicate scale always discloses a difference. Again, one can object, but a pound of sugar is equal to itself. Neither is this true. All bodies change uninterruptedly in size, weight, color, etc. They are never equal to themselves. A is not A, dog is not dog, a pound of sugar is not equal to a pound of sugar, you are not yourself. These sorts of apparently contradictory phrases sometimes make the dialectic seem to revel in contradiction. But that's not quite the point, not to me at least. Remember, if one A and another A are different, then simply stating A does not equal A is not contradictory, but a very plain and obvious statement of fact. So I understand the dialectic as a commentary on human categories, on the names we give things. Because contradiction is inextricable from the way we conceptualize, from the way we think, to use language is to make abstractions. It is to speak in terms of categories, or to describe something even as it continues to change, and our words are left chasing its scent. To think at all is to use the names we have for objects or feelings or motions or ideas. We are Irenio's opposite in this way. He must see infinite particulars, but we must see some finite number of the fixed names we have given to a limited range of particulars. Particulars which often we don't even see as the sum of their own varied particularities, but simply as full and whole and pure objects in and of themselves. We see A as wholly purely A, not as three lines joined together in a specific way to resemble the symbol A. And we understand each instance of a dog as a full and true instance of a dog, not as the unique evolutionary product of millions of minor genetic adaptations through time. Borges describes the difference between us thus: a circle drawn on a blackboard, a right triangle, a lozenge, all these are forms we can fully and intuitively grasp. Arrhenius could do the same with the stormy mane of a pony, with a herd of cattle on a hill, with the changing fire and its innumerable ashes, with the many faces of a dead man throughout a long wake. I don't know how many stars he could see in the sky. Where Arrhenius sees several hundred thin lines of paper shifting and decaying in the shade of a room, we see a book. And a minute later, when Arrhenius has now observed those hundreds of thin lines crawl nearer to their death as the shade expands from the 213th line to the 212th, and the room approaches a dusk it has never felt before and will never feel again, we would just say the sun is setting as it always does, and that the book is the same exact book from a minute ago, because it's the same copy of the same pages with the same text. Neither of us are really wrong, neither of us are really right, at least depending on what we mean by wrong and right. The trick here, in my eyes, is to decide those meanings for ourselves by understanding where and when to open and close such a lens upon the world. Arrhenius, it seems, could use a bit of our ability to think and reason and speak in the inevitably abstract way which limits our perception. He could use the ability to see a circle as just a circle, and not as the unique, inimitable circle it happens to be. He could learn to step back and see that the book is just a book. Alternately, we could use a bit of Arrhenius' power to penetrate through the notion that things which are the same are actually similar. We could benefit from telling ourselves to look more deeply into difference. What makes Funes an impossible, tragic figure is that he could not stop. He had a kind of super dialectical perception of infinite particulars embedded in his brain, his eyes, his memory, his skin. He couldn't escape the endless parade of particulars that would consume all our lives if we saw the world as he did. But we can turn Arrhenius' power on and off as we need. So although we do not necessarily need a new name for nationalism each and every day forever in both directions of time and all directions of space, we may still find it useful to distinguish between nationalism in the post-election landscape of the United States in the year 2020 and nationalism before that election, nationalism in the 19th century and nationalism in a globalized world, nationalism in Brazil, nationalism in Turkey, etc. Just like A is not equal to A, and just like the dog at 314 is different from the dog at 315, no two nationalisms are the same. In fact, no single nationalism is even the same as itself, since even the nationalism of one nation is constantly shifting through space and time along with its nation state, its demographics, its cultures, its geopolitical setting, its own internal resistance, and so on. By exploring the infinite space within the meaning of each of our words, while remembering not to lose ourselves, we can begin to understand what it means for a word to be contradictory in the dialectical sense. There are always more distinctions to be drawn. This does not just apply to the usual dichotomies, darkness and light, absent and present, up and down, being and nothing. It also applies to the very real contradictions in the word nationalism, when that word is meant to contain both our understanding of nationalism in America and also nationalism in Turkey. Those two nations are different in enough senses that the word nationalism, which contains both of them, must then be self-contradictory, just as the word screwdriver is contradictory when it somehow means both Phillips and flathead. If I asked you to hand me the screwdriver, and you looked down at the desk and saw a toolbox of a dozen different types of screwdrivers, you would ask me to clarify what I meant by screwdriver. In the language of dialectics, you might ask me to be more determinative or more concrete. It's not fundamentally any different from the realization that screwdriver is a contradictory concept in the world, because it contains multitudes of meanings, some of them mutually exclusive. And after all, maybe I was just asking for my vodka orange juice. That is the heart of the dialectic, at least as I employ it. No magic, no metaphysics, no morals, only meaning. The dialectic is not an escape into contradiction, but an unending wrestling with the choice of which contradictions must be broken into separate pieces by more rigorous precision, and which contradictions are good enough for the purpose at hand. No one can answer that question for us. We have to decide for ourselves every time we think about everything. We cannot escape contradiction any more than Ireneo. He could see with infinite precision, we cannot. But regardless, we each have no choice but to use words which are in some deep, irredeemable sense contradictory. Even for Ireneo, with his godlike faculties, words could not grasp reality. So what hope do we have? Unlike Ireneo, therefore, we must rest in the insight of the story's narrator, who critiques the prodigious observer, saying, I suspect that Ireneo was not very capable of thought. To think is to forget differences, generalize, make abstractions. In the teeming world of Funes, there were only details. In other words, we can grant ourselves the space to distinguish between when the contradictions present in a word are and are not relevant. We can choose when to be more particular or conversely more abstract, depending on our needs. I prefer to give this strategy a proper name, the pragmatist dialectic. Pragmatist for two reasons. First, because it explicitly connects the alternate unraveling and preserving of contradiction to praxis, the very task we need the target word to perform based on our preferences or goals. Do I want to wrestle the concept of nationalism from its infinite expressions in order to more concretely examine what it means to be nationalist at this moment? Or am I trying to connect those infinite expressions together into a common theme, which I will invariably call nationalism? Similarly, do I need to wrestle the concept of myself from its infinite expressions in order to more concretely examine what it means to be me at this moment? Or am I trying to connect those infinite expressions together into a common theme, which I will invariably call me? Are we in a bar when I say, hand me my screwdriver? Or are we in a shed? Will those hearing me understand? Do I even want to be understood? And since I, like you, am in a constant trance of self-overhearing, will I understand myself? Will understanding help me or help us establish a better space for the politics we wish to pursue? Will it help us sustain or expand democracy, solidarity, compassion? The second reason to call this a pragmatist dialectic is because it sets aside questions about the nature of reality in favor of more grounded questions about human needs. This just means we accept that whatever reality might entail, we aren't required to figure it out before we breathe or move or work. Remember, with the dialectic in our utility belt, we're in a good position to find whatever differences we want, and some questions just don't make much of a difference. Ireneo is stuck forever chasing reality as it really is. Not only will he never succeed, but there is the added irony that even Ireneo's eyes miss important details. Does Ireneo see atoms, quarks, electrons, colliding black holes? For that matter, does Ireneo see your thoughts or your life or your struggle? Does Ireneo see every small transaction or theft or tale on the other side of the globe? Does Ireneo see every birth, every death, every movement, every moment? Or is Ireneo rather like a lonely digger, deeply lost down the tunnel of his own experience? If that's the case, then couldn't we make the argument that you and I actually see more of the world as it is than Ireneo does? After all, why should it be that we say Ireneo is closer to reality for seeing more details, instead of claiming we are closer to reality for seeing more themes? To speak, to think, to use language is to be wrapped up in a world not so much of reality, but of words. And that invariably means participating in a process that isn't very well equipped to get us closer to anything, but which is very well equipped to get us to exactly where we define ourselves to be. G.K. Chesterton once said, "The purpose of opening the mind, as with the mouth, is to shut it again on something solid." Similarly, the purpose of pointing out a contradiction in a word is not to follow the path of Ireneo and continue doing so forever until we forfeit all human meaning and direction and history and experience, bitterly or cleverly determining that all truth is unknowable and everything is ineffable and all our language is hopelessly inadequate. Remember that this hopelessness is precisely what Arrhenius felt as he considered building his own personal language that could cope with his experience. I would imagine we have all felt that hopelessness. Anything you will ever hear me say or read me write is merely, powerfully, my attempt to build my own personal language that can cope with my experience. And I could say the same for you, which means we all could sometimes find use in the reminder that needlessly hyping all the things we don't know or don't see or don't remember is a uniquely human masochism that betrays our power, as well as our responsibilities. At the end of Funes the Memorious, the narrator relates a similar fear, that each of my words, that each of my movements would persist in Arrhenius' implacable memory. I was benumbed by the fear of multiplying useless gestures. Useless because they would only add some infinite set of particulars to Arrhenius' already burdened inner world. But we don't have to burden ourselves with infinity. We can recognize that our language is already quite adequate because its purpose is not to describe reality in all its perfect movements and complexities, whatever that might mean, but simply to get a hold of some part of our world just long enough to bend it or bend ourselves or bend our understanding to a purpose that benefits us. This narrative wins back to us what is most sacred, the accessible. It celebrates human touch. Because while we may lose a lot thanks to our forgetfulness, thanks to the limits of our perception, what we receive in exchange is almost by definition intelligible, something we can talk about, something we can relate to, something we can share. How should we really conceive the word moment? If it is an infinitesimal interval, if it is an infinitesimal interval of time. If it is an infinitesimal interval of time. Okay. If it is an infinitesimal